So, a warm welcome back to Natasha Hausdorff. She's an international law expert, legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, and a barrister at Six Pump Court Chambers. She's an expert commentator on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. She holds law degrees from both Oxford and Tel Aviv universities and a former clerk to Israel's Chief Justice at the Supreme Court. Also, she recently founded and is the president of the Center for International Rule of Law in New York. Welcome back, Natasha. How are you?
It's wonderful to be back with you. Doing well, thank you. How are you all keeping?
We're doing well also. Here's also Dr. Leif Knudsen joining us here as well. And we thought we're going to talk today with you about two topics, especially. We're going to talk about the new proposed trade ban here in Norway on Israeli settlements, and also the UN report claiming that Israel is targeting children on purpose. But perhaps we start with the new proposed trade ban here in Norway, just to talk a little bit about it. What are your general thoughts about just from looking at it? What are your initial thoughts?
Well, I've seen the invitation to consultation, and I think the deadline for that is coming up in September. And that states that this proposal supposedly stems from the fact that Israeli settlements in what it calls Palestine violate international law and undermine the prospects for what it terms a peaceful two-state solution. Now, this, of course, comes on the context that the Norwegian government has previously advised against trade and business activities that it claims contribute to sustaining the settlements. So, firstly, Henrik, this ban, which is proposed on the import of goods which originate in settlements, and also, it's fair to say, the export of goods that are destined for settlements, it also, I think, includes a proposal that there's a ban on the purchase of property and also the provision of construction, engineering, architectural, and real estate brokerage
Fair.
to any entities linked to the development of what it calls settlements. And I think lastly, it's also proposed that the acquisition of any business operations headquartered in what it calls settlements also be banned. And it's quite concerning that there's a suggestion of the introduction of penal provisions associated with violations of these proposed prohibitions. There are a number of real problems with this, and I'll be happy to run through them, as quickly as possible for you. It's fair to say that the implication is that this will be applied to acts that are either committed in Norway or by Norwegian nationals or persons domiciled in Norway, and also enterprises registered in Norway. So this is pretty expansive. The major problem with this is that it's based in a total misapplication of international law to start with, as well as blatant discrimination against the Jewish state. So even this claim that Israeli settlements are in Palestine demonstrates that there are problems here. Of course, this is perhaps predicated on the Norway's recognition of Palestine in 2024. There are all sorts of problems with that in international law, namely that there is no state of Palestine. But what's being referenced here in this proposal relates to Jewish communities in Area C, which it's important to remember under internationally backed agreements in the Oslo Accords remained under Israeli administration. There are also increasing references to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion as a basis for these sorts of measures that suggested that Jews living in Judea and Samaria was unlawful. But it's important to recognize that even that ICJ opinion, which is not binding, does not create legal obligations that are being used misguidedly, I think, to justify initiatives of this nature, not just in Norway, but across much of Europe, in fact. The idea that settlements are unlawful is ultimately predicated on a misapplication of a provision of the Fourth Geneva Conventions, which is a prohibition on the state transfer of individuals into occupied territory. Now, we've previously talked about a whole host of problems with the proposed analysis under that. But for these purposes, I think it's just worth highlighting that nothing within the Geneva Conventions is a prohibition on economic activity, which is what this ban is seeking to address. At its best, and this is taking it at its highest, this argument would be a condemnation of state transfer, which doesn't exist here, but it's state activity rather than the activity of individual businesses. Then we've also got this major problem that this action would be unlawful. I would suggest it's discrimination under the WTO provisions, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, what you refer to as the GATT. And it's also very problematic in that it would put Norwegian companies potentially at risk of exposure to certain US federal and state laws, which prohibit or sanction compliance with boycotts of businesses in territories governed by Israel. And which also require the US trade negotiators, when they're entering into international trade negotiations, to take that into consideration. But ultimately, what this proposal would do would be the opposite of promoting peace. The product of these goods that are referenced in this ban in the West Bank or in Judea and Samaria are in many ways beneficial to the Arab Palestinian population. As of, I think, 2018, in terms of Israeli businesses in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, they employed approximately 30,000 Arab Palestinians at the time. And those are at salaries, you have to remember, that are far more, sometimes 3 times the average of what they would be paid in Palestinian-run businesses. And considering the families of these workers, as well as the Arab Palestinians who provide these goods and services to them, I mean, these are salaries that provide the livelihoods of potentially hundreds of thousands of Arab Palestinians. And importantly, they promote people-to-people cooperation, coordination, business and trade. So that's really what would promote peace and reconciliation, that the maintenance of these sorts of businesses, not the banning, which is what's being proposed, unfortunately, by this consultation at the moment, but I'm anticipating it will become some law in due course.
I just it struck me that they explicitly also included East Jerusalem, right? Well, any territory that was outside the Green Line, they've included in that. So that means also any economic activity that supports Jewish life in East Jerusalem, and also for that matter, Hebron and Shechem and other places that have a rich Jewish history. And then the other issue is that they explicitly exempt anything that could potentially benefit Palestinian interests from this as well, which to me raises all kinds of issues about interpretation, but also how they're going to investigate this, because they're supposed to be investigating matters that take place outside the shores of Norway, and thereby raises the issue of people reporting real or imagined infractions against this to Norwegian authorities. And who would that target but Norwegian Jews?
It's a very fair observation. And I think the fact that this is made explicit in the limited information that's so far been published, that there would be an exception for activity that is to assist the Arab Palestinian population, just makes it sort of totally unavoidable, the discrimination that exists here. It's fair to say that this has been building for some time, and it's certainly built upon by the International Court of Justice advisory opinion I mentioned, which actually called for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from these areas, and as you rightly point out, including East Jerusalem. Some, of the holiest sites for Jews that are existing there, and of course, where freedom of religion has only existed since Israel recovered that territory from Jordanian occupation in 1967. So everything that the people promoting this measure claim to support is really dealt a very problematic blow by this proposal. And I don't think we can get away from the arbitrary discrimination against a very particular country or territory, a very particular people, when one considers the number of real occupied territories that exist in the world, where there are actual settlements which could arguably be described as illegal under the proper application of Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and there are no calls for any distinctions to be made, for discrimination in respect of those territories, when it's only Israel and the Jews that are being singled out. I think there are really serious questions that are raised.
One more thing is that Norway traditionally has always looked at sanctions and activities like that within the context of broad international cooperative efforts, like either in conjunction with the EU or the UN and so forth. And this is a case where the government is sort of going on its own. And they do claim that other countries are considering similar measures, such as Ireland, not Slovenia anymore, obviously, but Spain. And so they are using, it looks to me like they are looking at this as a case that is distinctive. I guess the word is sui generis from everything else in international in international affairs. And then it also seems to me that this is something that does not affect Norwegian interests in any way at all.
Well,
Right?
I
This
think
does not
I,
promote
I
Norwegian
it
interests
would
in any
affect.
way.
I would argue that it would affect Norwegian interests, and it would potentially damage them enormously, not least because of the US provisions that I mentioned. And that was
Mhm.
one of the key arguments that I raised when I was addressing the Irish Parliament, the Oireachtas, on the potential consequences of their proposals, which are similar to what is being mooted here in Norway. But there's the additional problem with respect to the Irish proposals that they would fall foul of European Union provisions and legislation. And so, albeit Norway doesn't face that hurdle, there are still really significant problems with respect to discrimination under the WTO, under the GATT. There has to be a an explanation or where quantitative restrictions are imposed or tariffs introduced. There has to be a justification for it. So restrictions are not going to be permitted unless there is a strong justification for those restrictions in all the circumstances, and importantly, that they don't discriminate between different territories where those relevant considerations are similar. And so that's where Norway really, I think, stands to fall foul of those
Mhm.
international agreements and those provisions, because under Article 20 of the GATT, subject to the requirement that measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries. And so those same provisions need to prevail. That there's nothing really that can justify the position that is being taken so far in this proposal.
I have another question related to sort of general jurisprudence, which is that the fact that they're imposing you alluded to this earlier, that they're using the penal code for this particular issue.
Yeah.
And I did a little research, and in Norway it says that this penal code should only be applied to acts that either lead to harm or could lead to harm if other reactions are not available or are not or aren't can't achieve the purpose, and that there needs to be a cost benefit consideration. Is this the kind of thinking that you know with your legal background is the kind of threshold for penal code to be applied
Well,
toward individuals?
it begs the question: what is the harm? Because as I addressed earlier, all this measure actually introduces harm in terms of the benefit to the local Arab Palestinian population, introduces harm in terms of the prospects for peaceful resolution going forward, is based on absolutely no moral justification that can be properly identified. Everything that is being suggested is an inversion of how international law applies, and supports this idea that Jews need to be ethnically cleansed from these territories, which is objectionable and bizarre. And so the idea that a penal provision would be justified in this respect is really difficult to sustain. But I read those provisions also in the Norwegian Penal Code, and it is an extreme provision, and it's something that will, under what's being proposed, apply extraterritorially, and may even open up the door to measures being taken, or litigation, prosecutions, even in Norway, it seems to me, on the basis of other extraneous provisions. For example, under the Rome Statute, there are initiatives to be able to bring the sort of lawfare practices that we are witnessing at the level of the ICJ and at the ICC to domestic jurisdiction level. And I fully anticipate that this proposal is part and parcel of that pattern and of that strategic initiative, specifically by those that wish to target Israel and Jews. But I anticipate that once these practices are established, it's not going to end with Israel, and really that this, sets the precedent for measures to be taken against, many participants in the free world under a sort of politicized process.
So how do we fight this?
I'm in your hands. Certainly, UKLFI will be putting in a submission as part of the consultation process and highlighting some of the issues that I've touched upon, some of the consequences also for Norway, just as we've done with respect to the Netherlands, just as we've done with respect to Ireland and many other instances. So we can certainly help on the legal analysis and on highlighting the pitfalls and the consequences just for Norwegian businesses and Norwegian individuals. But really, there needs to be a reckoning, I think, politically, and an understanding domestically of what the consequences of something like this would be.
Could this also be a slippery slope internationally? Like, if this actually becomes the law in Norway, does this potentially open up for even more extreme measures? And could other countries look to Norway and use this as the standard for which they can build their laws upon?
I mean, yes. Norway, of course, is not the only example here. So there are others that people are necessarily drawing upon. I think the fact that this is a very prominent example outside of the European Union will be significant. And every further step, every further country that falls to this sort of political pressure is, another piece of the Jenga tower being pulled out, as it were. So yeah, I do think that is concerning. It's worth stressing, though, that one of the key considerations that the Irish seem to have taken to heart is America's response. And so these extensive federal and state laws which prohibit or sanction compliance with boycotts of businesses and territories governed by Israel, and also require the U.S. trade negotiators to address this issue. They also impose serious liabilities and sanctions on U.S. companies that participate in boycotts of this nature, and that's really going to limit the ability of U.S. Companies to engage with Norway, with other Norwegian businesses, if they are going to be limited by these proposals in the way that's suggested.
Yeah.
Could individuals also be sanctioned through these mechanisms?
Well, that's certainly the proposal under, as I understand it, under the use of the penal statute in Norway. Yes.
No, I meant could the US
Oh, I
US
see.
laws and the state laws in the US also impose sanctions on individuals in Norway who are supporting this?
Well, that's a very different question, and it's in relation to, I would say, a political decision by the US government, by the State Department. So in the vein that we've seen sanctions on individuals that are leading some of this hostility, for example, Francesca Albanese or Karim Khan at the ICC, or some of the ICC judges. But the anti-boycott legislation in the US would concern companies rather than individuals.
Right.
Yeah. Also, we should spend some time on this new UN report that some people are using for all that it's worth. We've seen examples here in Norway with our own foreign minister, Espen Barth Eide, who was out in the newspaper saying that, look, even UN now is saying that Israel is targeting children on purpose. Of course, they're using this report as of late. What are your thoughts about this report, Natasha?
It's in some ways not surprising because it is built upon a great deal of the misinformation which has already been circulating, not just through the Commission of Inquiry, but also through the NGOs that have provided most of the material upon which this latest report is based. I mean, it's deeply concerning, of course, even if it's not surprising, because it is the most evident manifestation of the ancient blood libel that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood in the modern context, that Israel and the IDF is deliberately targeting Palestinian children. And the report itself is an abomination. It is the presentation of Hamas propaganda filtered through many of the NGOs, as we previously discussed, with this kind of UN stamp of approval, so that you have exactly the kind of comment that you've alluded to, that even the UN now says. I mean, that's a nonsense. It's been certainly presented in this form to enable it to be deployed at international courts and tribunals, including the ICC and the ICJ. I mean, there's a clear indication, I think, even in the press release by the Commission of Inquiry, that this is their intention. But when you actually look at what is produced, it is devoid of any evidence. It is based entirely on hearsay and supposition and reports of supposed witnesses in Gaza controlled by Hamas. And we've seen a number of these stories developing. I recall certainly hearing the testimony of a doctor who had been British doctor in the Houses of Parliament here in the UK, in the Palace of Westminster, in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee, telling the members of the committee that he had witnessed children being brought into hospital, that he'd operated on them, who'd been shot, in the head and various other body parts. And he gave evidence that they had been shot by Israeli quadcopters that he claimed hovered over these children that were wounded and shot them in the head, an execution style. Now, not only had he never witnessed this himself, he was simply treating children who had been brought into hospital in this condition. We know the evidence exists of Hamas shooting children, civilians, in this fashion. There is no evidence that exists of Israelis doing so. In fact, all of the evidence demonstrates the complete contrary, because unlike Hamas, the IDF has a army that not just applies international law, but in so many respects goes well above it in seeking to prevent civilian casualties, taking more measures than any other army to evacuate civilians, to take precautions, to protect civilians and provide for them in the context of this armed conflict, including in terms of the provision of aid. But there is no question that the IDF targets children. The IDF targets combatants and military installations. It is Hamas, we know, that shoots civilians either to prevent them. In the early days of the war, we saw this on US-produced video, that prevented them from fleeing from areas that were slated for evacuation, and later on also were shooting them to prevent them from accessing aid that was being provided by NGOs, including the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and also would routinely shoot supposed collaborators in the street. I mean, these were public executions and often videoed. So we have that evidence on the one hand, no evidence of the allegations that are being advanced in this report, which are completely contrary to the way the IDF operates. And yet we see these allegations spreading like wildfire. So it's extremely concerning, but not surprising that this has been reiterated in another UN report. And I would argue that the damage that it does to the credibility of these institutions, these organizations, the Commission of Inquiry, the UN in general, is very significant.
How is this being received in the UK, and why aren't we seeing more objections to these kinds of malicious reports that are obviously based on lies?
Well, because most people take it at face value. And if the UN says, as you've just quoted, it must be right. That's unfortunately the position that I think the general public and many governments around the world have essentially found themselves in. The problem, though, is that it's taking the propaganda of terrorist organizations at face value. And it's also, this is an important point, turning international law on its head. So this report argues on the basis of these supposed testimonies that Israel was clearly targeting children. And that is an inversion of the way that analysis is generally expected to work, especially in the context of the law of armed conflict, which is intention-based, not effects-based. So you look at what was the intention of the commander that ordered the strike. And in that respect, Israel has shared some of that sensitive information, the targeting decisions, the analysis, the proportionality equation that goes into it, has shared that previously with the UK. I'm pretty sure with the deterioration relations, that's not the case under this government, but also with the US. And at the time, there were repeated statements from both of those governments that they had no concerns with Israel's targeting and proportionality and the requirements that international law sets down, that Israel was certainly fulfilling those. So that's the evidence as to the intention of the strikes, of the targeting, of the conduct of the Israeli Defense Forces. What we've had in this report is the complete opposite of that, this sort of fabrication and fantasy which is put forward in order to supplant that real evidence. But it also, very significantly, doesn't mention Hamas. It doesn't talk about the context in which Israel is fighting this armed conflict in Gaza. It doesn't talk about Hamas's use of civilians as human shields. It, in fact, suggests that bombing an area which may be populated is automatically unlawful, which is simply not how international law works, not how the law of armed conflict works, which is very problematic, I would suggest, for any countries that are taking this as read in terms of the interpretation or the manipulation of the law of armed conflict here. But the last thing I would say is that the real tragedy is that this is ultimately whitewashing the crimes of Hamas. I don't mean just, shooting civilians in the street, as I described before, but also their very use of civilians as human shields, which reports of this nature and the rhetoric coming out of it seek to encourage. They seek to encourage the tactics of terrorist organizations of this nature to continue to embed themselves amongst civilian populations, to prevent civilians from leaving, and to use them as human shields or human sacrifices, because it is serving their purpose. We know that when Hamas launched this war on the 7th of October, the propaganda aspect of it was a central motivating factor. It didn't have a hope of winning against Israel, but seeking to turn public opinion precisely with reports of this nature, which put forward this blood libel, this fantasy, and give it the stamp of approval of the United Nations. This is exactly what Hamas was aiming for, and the UN is giving it to them on a silver platter.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that I've been noticing too, and that is that it seems to me that most of the law in armed conflict assumes that it's a conventional war between two parties that both subscribe to the same rules. But what we're having here is, in these days, somebody shows up on a pitch to play football, and the other the other team shows up with baseball bats and steel-tipped boots, and doesn't care about those rules. And I realize that there is some provision in these laws for this kind of asymmetrical situation. But if the reports don't take into account the actual situation on the ground, which is that one party uses protected people and plants as shields to, as part of their whole tactical process, then it should be incumbent on the other party to make sure that those tactics don't work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because otherwise you just encourage them to continue to use human shields and to continue to use schools and mosques and hospitals as, as part of their armament, so to speak. And this never seems to come up, this particular, how this changes sort of the dynamics of warfare, really.
Agreed. And of course, Israel's stuck between a rock and a hard place here, because certainly fighting a terrorist organization that subverts all of the rules of armed conflict doesn't absolve you of your obligations to comply with it. But also, I would suggest from everything that I've seen that the moral code of the IDF wouldn't permit it to divert from the very strict code of arms, purity of arms that it endorses in seeking to protect civilian life wherever possible, and frequently calling off strikes to protect civilians that are in the vicinity because of Hamas tactics, and not taking out terrorists because of the excessive collateral damage that might result as a consequence. I mean, there's a reason that this war has dragged out for so long. and that is it. If you think of the counterfactual here, what would the situation have been if these civilians were actually permitted to leave, were not unprecedentedly, forcibly kept in a war zone, as the international community has endorsed when Egypt closed its border? Contrary to Egypt's obligations under international law, I'll add, under the African Union Convention on Refugees, that it was required to permit facilitate the exit of civilians fleeing civil disorder. They could have been evacuated into Egyptian Rafah. I'm not suggesting that they moved to Egypt, but into a humanitarian zone, the other side of the border, where they could have been protected and provided for without aid being diverted by Hamas, and where they wouldn't have been able to be used as human shields. How different this war would have looked. How much more speedily might Hamas have been defeated for the benefit of the Arab Palestinians as well as the Israelis. That's really challenging when you think of how the international community has, not just in the context of these reports, played into the hands of Hamas, but also in this very real context, this practical context of subjecting these Arab Palestinians to the brutality and the exploitation of Hamas, and the consequences, which is that so many of them have been living in abject, just terrible circumstances, or have lost their lives as a result of this terrorist organization's conduct and the international community's acquiescence to it. I mean, these are things that many people are not taking into consideration, and very, very rarely are they discussed.
If I may ask, since you're in the UK, does anybody ever bring up parallels to the situation in Northern Ireland up until the Good Friday Accord? Because that was also sort of a unconventional, I don't know if you could call it war or simply troubles or certainly armed conflict that was going on there, with also similar asymmetry.
They do frequently bring up these comparisons, and often the adage is, "Oh well, we were able to make peace in Northern Ireland, so it would be possible in similar circumstances. Where there's a will, there's a way." And what I think many people fail again to acknowledge is that money played a very significant part in bringing the terrorist entity to the table. You may recall that at the time Tony Blair made it a condition of entering the so-called war on terror with the United States. It made it a condition that the US stop funding terrorism through the IRA against British citizens. And it was at that point that much of the funding dried up. And it was subsequent to that, really, that negotiations were able to bear fruit. And when we think of the amount of funding, and the UK has just announced a further £23 million to UNRWA, an organization that has not just been at the center of propagating this conflict through its indoctrination of Palestinian children in UNRWA-run schools, but it has also been entirely complicit in the 7th of October attacks, with goodness knows how many now, it's increasing all the time, UNRWA employees directly involved in those atrocities, and harboring Hamas terrorists in Gaza throughout the remainder of this war, where UNRWA facilities have been used as part of the Hamas terror infrastructure, where it is entirely intertwined with the terrorist entities that are subjugating the Palestinian people in Gaza. And, we see the international community continuing to fund it. So to the extent, and I would really resist that, comparisons here have much of a benefit, because we are dealing with a very, very different nature of terrorist activity in terms of this Islamism and the Muslim Brotherhood aspects of, Iranian terror proxies. It is terror, I'm afraid to say, on a very different scale. But to the extent that comparisons are able to assist at all, then we ought to take notice of the impact that the continued funding of these terrorist organizations has in propagating conflict and in, minimizing the impact or effect of any potential negotiations or prospects of resolution.
I know you have to run soon, Natasha, but just a final question. How dangerous are these kinds of modern day blood libels with these reports, and what kind of harm can they cause?
Well, I've mentioned briefly already the harm that I think it is doing to the integrity of the international legal order, the rules-based order. But I think it's also important to reference the rising anti-Semitism, because that is ultimately, what these blood libels are geared towards, what they emanate from, and also what they propagate. The notion that Jews would be killing children for sport, essentially, which is what this report suggests, endorses, is abominable, is reprehensible. It is part and parcel of painting Jews as evil, as reprehensible figures to be combated, to be attacked. And we are seeing deadly attacks on Jewish communities around the world directly as a result of this increasing rhetoric, this false rhetoric, endorsed as it is now, even by the United Nations. And that is the undeniable consequence of these false stories that are being propagated. And we've seen an increasingly fantastical nature of these false allegations. It's as though every week there has to be some one-upmanship on the reprehensible falsehoods of the previous week. And it is spiraling out of control. And the consequences of that, the physical consequences of that on the safety of Jews around the world, cannot be denied.
Yeah, because if people walk around persuaded that Jews are killing children for sports, there's no limits to what you can do towards Jews. Yeah.
Precisely.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for your time, for stopping by the podcast once again and sharing your analysis and thoughts.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.